morning, everybody. This is John. I am down in Myrtle Beach today, and I have a spectacular room near the beach where I've built my own little TV studio. And I've been working on a couple things. A few of you probably don't know that much about my company, so I wanted to tell you a little bit about what I was doing and what I am doing. But eventually, essentially what I started out trying to do was to build web services that I could offer to corporations in a scalable way that would support really any technology. So I wanted to build a web framework that I could offer and duplicate. And as I started working on that, my model was my Broadwing.com website that I had in Austin, because it had all of the unified communications and wholesale services that I required. So that system essentially was a front end to multiple back-end databases, most of which were SQL Server oriented. So for example, we had a SQL Server database called Onyx, which was our internal ERP system, and Broadwing.com would allow customers to enter trouble tickets in the Broadwing system and put those into Onyx, essentially. And once you had Onyx, you could link to accounts, sales. So it's similar to Salesforce, but it's a little more open platform. So Onyx, as it turns out, is the best trouble ticket system in the world. And we were able to customize Onyx to allow us to do resolution codes and other things. So my initial goal was to rebuild Broadwing.com and still have a SQL backend. And then if I could do that, then I could probably link to things like Microsoft Dynamics, accounting system, and the like. But as I guess I was sort of the designer and chief architect of the Broadwing sales model. And we did, along with Onyx, we also built a competitive database. We built a special pricing database. We built a product catalog and pricing system. And we exposed all of those to Broadwing.com. So Broadwing.com was essentially just a shell, and we presented our different databases to this system. And the reason that was important for me is because I went to work after I left Cincinnati Bell and Broadwing, I went to work for Verizon, and Verizon had bought this company called Hughes Telematics. And Hughes Telematics had a website, obviously, and they also had a fleet service where they were tracking fleet vehicles, their maintenance records, where they were as far as location. And you can even track, if people are going out for donuts during the day. So this system was pretty sophisticated, but the problem was that it only had a partition size of about 100 objects. And when you were reviewing those objects, you were doing it inside of a Google grid. So so many of you have probably used Uber by now, or Lyft, and those systems essentially show you where your driver is and where you are. It's only really 2 objects. But when you get into a fleet service, you get to 1,000 objects or more. And what I was trying to do is present a proximity database where you might have thousands of objects in a system that were co-located. So the issue that I had at Verizon was that the Hughes Telematics database architecture wasn't sufficient to cache the the global internet or the global tags that were out there. So so really two challenges. One, you have to build a front end system that can take multiple databases, and then you have to have a transaction database store that can keep anything. So as I started thinking about the two tasks, just collecting location or enhanced metadata is a project in itself, and if I wanted to expose and interface with other carriers, I needed to do that sort of separately. So my idea initially was to have our Verizon response as not Verizon Wireless, but a sort of a spin-off of our wholesale group where we could collect our own information, interface with AT&T and Sprint, and get all the mobility data in the US, which was our initial goal. And then we wanted to be able to add value-added service providers like General Dynamics and SAIC that might be able to take those location objects and make them valuable. So if you start with that idea that you have a content store and you want to make the transition to offering services upstream to individual enterprises, you have to be able to partition and create a shell. So what I've done is I have essentially rebuilt Broadwing.com to be what I'm calling the Greenville Associates Fusion web server. And what it does is it builds an Apache platform that can be extended to any open source database effectively. But I can also put any custom code into my shell, including Visual Studio, outputs, any kind of Adobe Cold Fusion platforms, etc. So my system allows me to match 3GL languages like Wix with custom development, and that allows you to really put any application upstream of the shell. So it's a little more advanced than what Broadwing was doing, in that I can really host not just my own code but anybody's code. And then I can expose those to any database. So that's really cool. Now, as I was going through this, I wanted to start with a base web server. And if any of you have ever tried to use Linux, Linux has a lot of interesting applications that have been integrated. But if you try to do it on your own, it takes on the order of 3 to 5 years is what it has actually taken me to go through all the variants of Linux, to understand why they were different, and then to come up with my own implementation. So what Linux is doing is they're essentially taking all the research community and they're packaging it on top of a special kernel, but most of the file system from Unix and all of the C libraries are the same. So essentially, if you use Linux, you've got the same development environment, and that means that most of the applications from Unix work on Linux as well. But as I started going through this, there was a company called cPanel, which is was originally a Pennsylvania company and now is in Houston. And cPanel has taken the effort to build essentially an administrator GUI for the Linux operating system, and it allows you to configure and back up databases, to build websites, to do traditional tasks like email and FTP. And so cPanel is a fantastic environment, and it also allows you to configure PHP, which is a development framework that's used extensively on the internet. So I have started with cPanel, and I was sort of disappointed in some of the features that I was limited with, and wanted to add things like Microsoft SQL Server, a firewall, VPN capability, remote desktop, etc. So Greenville Associates has built our own extensions to cPanel, and we are essentially rebranding those, and we're calling them Panel Plus. So I'm taking a traditional cPanel server and I'm adding a lot of features to them. So Panel Plus is out there. Now, as you start with Panel Plus, it is a Red Hat and CentOS Linux variant. And it's limiting in that it doesn't support some of the, for example, unified communications platforms. So what I did is I created a version of my same add-ons into what I'm calling Panel Pro, and that is essentially a Debian Linux platform that's all mine, that doesn't have anything to do with cPanel. But it used the same directory structure that I was adding on for my framework. So I like cPanel because it allows me to develop HTML applications and JavaScript very quickly in their framework, and it also has a file system. But I've added webmin to both the original cPanel, my Panel Plus, my Panel Pro. So I've essentially built a platform that's about 30% better than traditional cPanel, and then I've extended that to unified communications. So my company in itself, over time, just doing that is a big deal. And then from my experiences at Bank of America, I know how to extend those services, not just from the cloud, but all the way into the hybrid. So as I started thinking about building my servers, I wanted to be able to host them, and then that's when I decided I was going to make Capital Technology a hosting company for my particular variants. So that means that I had to get my images into Google Cloud and into Amazon Cloud, which I've already done. So I've done that in two ways. One, I built entire images from scratch, and the second way is I've used Git as an application delivery vehicle. So Capital Technology is a spin-off of Verizon Federal, and it is an AI-based metadata system that I'm not going to cover today. But it's quite elaborate, and the backbone architecture and the VPN technology that I've deployed are more advanced than what Verizon has, what AT&T has, and obviously what CenturyLink has. So I believe that Capital Technology will be a beast in itself, and I'm going to fundraise for that sometime this year. So my goals for Greenville Associates were not only to build these servers, but I also wanted to be able to build high availability frameworks for the ERP systems that I support. So it's not just a server, because a server has to do work. So I decided that if I could support Onyx, I could support Sugar, which is an open source version of Onyx, and I could support Microsoft Dynamics, then I would have something. So I started building, my shell is called Fusion. So I have Fusion Shell, and then I have a back office system that I've linked to Fusion Shell, which I call Fusion Open, which is an open source back office system. It includes accounting and the like. And I've also created, or in process of creating, Fusion Pro, which would integrate either Oracle, Microsoft Dynamics, or SAP into my web framework. So what is a web framework? a web framework is essentially a marketing tool where you're creating products and services that you want to sell on the web to your customers. But when you go to the enterprise environment, you have other things like investor relations, you have corporate governance issues and the like. And so as you add those items into a shell, it becomes sort of in a life of its own. But you might want to add polls, customer care surveys. You might want to link to your customer contact center. So my goal is that Fusion Pro will be an ERP system in itself. As I'm sort of writing my own code, I'm filling in the blocks. But I started out by building extensions to Microsoft Dynamics that would do an entire IT inventory and sort of an extended framework that isn't available in the core product. So I have a lot of things going on in Greenville that's important in itself, and I've added some features to Capital Technology. Now, what I'm doing in Capital Technology is completely different, and I'm trying to solve hosting challenges that I had at Bank of America where I was the CTO. So at Bank of America, we tried to host about 10,000 applications. So it was on the order of 500 times more complicated than CenturyLink or Verizon are today. And most of those applications are business unit centric items. For example, at Bank of America Cards, they have different portfolios for different customers, and credit analysts usually do transaction dumps from the mainframe system into these modeling databases where they can look at profitability on a particular set of customers. And they do that because they're a wholesale provider and an affinity provider. So what happens at Bank of America Cards is that they have these extracts, and some of them can get to be 40, 50, 100 gigs in size, and they start out in Excel and Access, and they end up saying, oh my gosh, this is so important to us, let's move it to SQL Server. So what's ending up happening at Bank of America is they're taking these massive Oracle databases that have every transaction, and they're splitting it out, and most of the analysts are coming out of college with not Oracle skills, but traditional Microsoft Office backgrounds, and they're teaching themselves how to use SQL over time. So what they learn in college isn't anywhere close to what our stack was. So that's what I'm seeing, just historically. And Avana, who ended up getting acquired by Fleet, and then Fleet getting acquired by Bank of America as well, we have sort of a legacy environment where we've rolled up all these card platforms. So I don't expect that Citigroup or Chase is any different. So the technology that I'm building should translate over. So, but anyway, to get back to the point, usually the credit analysts don't have a whole lot of need for high availability hosting. They're dumping transactions from the primary database and building views offline that they are modeling, and they're actually writing code against them. So these extracts are applications in themselves. So at Bank of America, we had 10,000 apps, but 9,000 of them were mostly credit and profitability views of the master systems, whereas 1,000 were actually high availability grid services. And where we got in trouble is that our corporate IT wanted to take all these extracts that at MBNA were just housed on somebody's high-end workstation and trying to put those all in tier. So if you take 9,000 applications and move them out of the LAN at Deerfield and you put them all into tier into Richmond, what ends up happening is host operations says, you can tell us all day long that this data doesn't matter, but I know that I'm going to get a call from your business unit president if it's even down for an hour. So what ended up happening is they would move applications out of Deerfield to Richmond data center, and then they would say, well, we're worried about that, so we're going to mirror it to Dallas. And then, of course, when you mirror and move something into tier, they say, well, then you have to have a DR plan, and then they would add Kansas City. So we ended up building from these simple credit analyst portfolios into these complex sort of geographies where we would argue over how valuable the data is. And then, of course, that person would go to work somewhere else who still had his work product hosted in tier, and you couldn't really get rid of it because there were 10 or 20 people still writing reports off of it. So that's what happens in the massive enterprise. That's what happens with financial services companies. And what I was trying to solve, what I have solved at Capital Technology, is the ability to host applications in an HA manner that's entirely consistent. Because the problem is you might have a credit analyst in Deerfield in Delaware, but merchant services is doing the same thing in Louisville, and they might pick different hosts. Like they might say Kansas City's the primary. I have merchant users in San Francisco, so my mirroring pattern is Louisville to Chicago to San Francisco. And when you do that with every application, you end up having not just 10,000 different applications, you have 10,000 different data architectures. And that's when you get to chaos. That's when you get to $20 billion of expense, etc. So what my model was for Capital Technology is to solve the Bank of America problems that are probably the largest enterprise in the world, or one of them with Chase and Wells probably equivalent. But I know how Bank of America solved it, and I don't necessarily have as much experience with the others. But it doesn't matter, because for Capital Technology, what we're trying to do is to build hosting grids that perform the same way regardless of what the app is. So if you had a full Microsoft Dynamics ERP delivery versus just the extract that I explained, you could host those in the same way. So what I'm doing is I'm building essentially high availability replication fabrics that can run in a box, inside of a room, inside of a school, inside of a metro bus, a metro train, or can extend to campuses, or to global delivery mechanisms that span continents. So for example, I can sync from Chicago to Miami and then add in Madrid and Frankfurt. So I can build replication models depending on what my customers' needs are, using the same application framework. So it's a very powerful mechanism, and I think I should be able to sell it very well into the wholesale markets for like Verizon and CenturyLink, who come to a Bank of America and say, well, I want to sell you a service, but they don't really have any idea what we're doing. The other problem is when you do these extracts, the value of the data, the liability associated with the platform is unknown. And so when you go to Bank of America supply chain, they just assume that the value is $1 trillion by default. So it's very hard to contract for a managed DBMS service. So if you start with somebody like cPanel, to come to Bank of America, they would have to stay on the low end and just say, hey, we're a Linux technology. They really can't get into the host replacement or the host architecture model, which is what I'm doing with Capital Technology. So Capital Technology isn't just a framework, it's absolutely a host replacement architecture, and it has a smart client solution. So I have a lot of work to do with CTS. It's going to be a revolution that's just very powerful, and I'm using all G-Sub-A code. I call it G-Sub-A, Greenville Associates. It's boring, but it's essentially G-Sub-A code written for Capital Technology, and so I've taken Fusion Shell and I've moved it over to the Capital business. So that's where I am right now. I'm building my first grids, and I built a Des Moines, Iowa to Berkeley County, South Carolina on Google Cloud, and I've extended that to Zurich and London. So my first grid allows me to deploy applications anywhere in North America and in the European Union, or most of the English-speaking world, in less than 15 seconds. So that's the goal, is to be able to deploy 10,000 apps on the same grid with the same architecture, using any database technology and being able to manage it. And if I can do that, then I can go back to my old company and say, this is what we're doing. And that's sort of the plan. So, for example, CTS probably could save Bank of America between $4 and $8 billion, like right away, using the technology we've already developed. So this is a game changer, and I'm very excited. My family doesn't quite understand what I'm doing, which is why I'm offering this video today. And to all my friends, neighbors, and countrymen from my former companies, what I'm doing is sort of beyond the 5-minute conversation at the dinner table. It's really breathtaking, and it would take a very long time for me to even give somebody a sound bite. So I think I've gone on about 40 minutes today. Just to summarize again, I built Greenville Associates as it's a packaged operating system and company, and it also has its own shell, and that shell is extending into its own ERP fabric. So G-Sub-A will be an enterprise software company over time. G-Sub-A will also be a professional services company that are helping businesses achieve success by including location into their marketing efforts. So you don't want to just blanket market. You want to market to customers that come to your area regularly, or might be in South Carolina, but we want to pull them into Myrtle Beach. So that kind of effort is what G-Sub-A is working on. Capital Technology is a hosting company. It's a host replacement company. It's a managed database company. It's a managed enhanced services company. And in the end, it will be a company with its own compilers and its own extension that will compete with Microsoft and Google down the road for search and enterprise services. It's a very, very, very important platform that is sort of a spin-off of the Hughes Telematics system that Verizon acquired for over $2 billion. So we're on that trajectory. That company should be huge. G sub A, I want to get some working products first, and then we'll raise some money to make that a little bigger. So hopefully that makes some sense to everybody. I've had some challenges along the way in that my scope is a little bigger than what someone would do on his own. But remember, the products that I was developing for I was actually hoping to replace Yahoo and Hughes Telematics at Verizon, and as a senior architect inside the corporation, I was building a product portfolio for them initially. And then as I went back to address the needs at CTS, I wanted to be able to do that for Bank of America and Chase and Wells and the others in financial services, just to do that. So I built a company that can support hundreds of products, and I'm not going after the widgets. So I want to build value for my children. I've written my own code, and I think I will do that for them as stockholders. Hopefully they catch the bug along the way and want to join me, but if they don't, I think my work will become more and more significant, and I continue to get faster in what I'm doing, because the front-end framework, the Broadwing.com, the Fusion shell, is a very, very time-consuming project, and it was even at Cincinnati Bell as well. We spent 2 or 3 years building their front-end architecture, and that was just to interface to COTS, or commercial systems that we bought in the background. So the Onyxes, the the Circuit Vision inventory databases, the Granite inventory systems, the automatic provisioning systems that you can buy. So what I've done already interfaces really to anything that I put behind it, and I've tested those already. So it's going to take me a little while. I'm trying to get my telecom professionals to engage with me to try to get a few people excited, but at this point we're sort of, although I've been doing this for several years, I'm sort of still in an early stage. But I think my brothers get it, because they work for Microsoft Consulting, and what they did was integrate Microsoft Dynamics for customers. But the problem with their model was they had to have leads from Microsoft generated, and they were just one of 5 or 6 vendors that would go out and try to sell customizations to Microsoft customer. Whereas we are going after every customer and trying to work around what they already have in the back office. So whether they're running Aloha or NCR back office, or they're a Micros customer, or they're an Oracle Financials customer, we're trying to build the marketing front ends that allow us to do e-commerce engines and essentially plug into what's existing. So we can build a web framework, an intranet, in hours, not days. And even Cincinnati Bell, or even Verizon, I can pretty much mock up all of their products within 5 or 6 hours now using my shell. And that's amazing. So that's about the long and short of it. I will provide some other information down the road, but I wanted to create sort of a longish video today. So I hope you have all have a good day. And to my kids, I love you very much. I hope to see you soon. Thanks.